This hearing will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the Budget Committee's hearing on the Department of Defense's fiscal year 2023 budget. At the outset, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time. Without objection, so ordered. I'll start by going over a few housekeeping matters. The committee is holding a hybrid hearing. Members may participate remotely or in person. For individuals participating remotely, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute a participant's microphone when the participant is not under recognition for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. If you are participating remotely and are experiencing connectivity issues, please contact staff immediately so those issues can be resolved. Members participating in the hearing room or on the remote platform are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition. We are not permitted to unmute members unless they explicitly request assistance. If you are participating remotely and I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask if you would like staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. They will not unmute your microphone under any other conditions. I'd like to remind members participating remotely in this proceeding to keep your camera on at all times, even if you are not under recognition by the chair. Members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. If you are on the remote platform and choose to participate in a different proceeding, please turn your camera off. Finally, we have established an email inbox for submitting documents before and during committee proceedings, and we have distributed that email address to everyone's staff. Now I will introduce our witness. This morning, we will be hearing from the Honorable Michael J. McCord, Undersecretary of Defense, Comptroller, and Chief Financial Officer at the U.S. Department of Defense. Welcome, Undersecretary. I now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome back Undersecretary Michael McCord to our committee. Thank you for joining us today for this hearing on the Department of Defense fiscal year 2023 budget. As the first person to be Comptroller at DOD twice, and with your decades-long career of service, including time on the staff of the House Budget Committee, your insights are particularly helpful to the work of the committee. I would like to begin this hearing by acknowledging our deep and enduring gratitude to those who serve our nation in uniform. We understand that Congress has a constitutional and moral responsibility to ensure that our service members are supported on and off the battlefield and that their families are cared for every step of the way. That is why the Biden budget provides members of our military with the largest pay increase in a generation. It funds a newly authorized basic needs allowance. It invests $12.2 billion to build more housing and medical facilities for military families, and it prioritizes programs that directly support military spouses, children, and other dependents. And it dedicates nearly $500 million to fully fund and implement vital programs to prevent and respond to sexual assault in the military. The Biden budget also ensures that the Department of Defense has the resources necessary to uphold our national security and protect our people at home and abroad. It does not aimlessly increase spending for its own sake without accountability or strategic rationale. It provides the smart investments that will make our country safer and meet the requests of the experts in charge. This budget is also forward-looking. It provides more than $130 billion for research and development to harness next-generation defense capabilities, the largest request on record. It invests in new technologies and includes $3.1 billion in funding to combat the destabilizing effects of the climate crisis and ensure our military installations are resilient against climate disasters. This is critical to our national defense. In a 2019 report, the Pentagon found that 46 of our nation's 79 high-priority military installations are vulnerable to climate change-related flooding, drought, desertification, and wildfires. President Biden also recognizes that ensuring America's national security extends far beyond our efforts to build weapons and military might. It is also about leveraging our power through diplomacy and deterrence. While these investments are not directly part of DOD's budget, they are a crucial part of the President's overall national defense strategy, and rightly so. As General James Mattis said in response to former President Trump's budget that slashed funding for the State Department, quote, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition ultimately." He was President Trump's Secretary of Defense when he said that. And I would add that we don't just save money by investing in diplomacy. We save lives by keeping members of our armed forces out of harm's way. This is a whole-of-government approach to national security. It's a budget that increases funding for the State Department and includes vital investments to strengthen NATO and support our European allies in the face of Russian aggression, to advance cybersecurity, and to maintain strong and credible deterrence. On all counts, President Biden's budget reflects the much-needed return of U.S. global leadership, a commitment not only to our democratic allies, but the democratic values our nation was founded upon, and the assurance that no dictator will have a foothold in this White House. Finally, let me stress again that this budget meets the needs articulated by the experts in charge of our national defense. If your argument is that we should fund the military at a level higher than Pentagon leaders say they need, then you have the burden of making the case that the world's most renowned defense experts are inept or intentionally undercutting our military. I don't think anyone here today can come close to making that point. To close, I'll quote Defense Secretary Austin. He said, and I quote, "We need resources matched to strategy, strategy matched to policy, and policy matched to the will of the American people. This budget gives us the resources we need to deliver on that promise." Undersecretary McCord, I look forward to hearing how the budget accomplishes this. I thank you again for your testimony and for appearing before our committee today. Now I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Undersecretary McCord. Thank you for being here today. The last time you were here, America was facing a number of crises at the border, at the checkout line, at the gas pump, and Republicans warned that the agenda President Biden was pursuing would only make these crises worse. Sadly, it turns out that we were right. Prices have spiked to the highest level in 40 years, 10.4% of an increase since Joe Biden took the oath of office. The cost of gas is through the roof, increase of 88.9% since Joe Biden took the oath of office. We have seen 2.9 million encounters at the southern border since Biden took office. These crises did not happen overnight or when Putin invaded Ukraine, as the White House is fond of arguing. They are the direct result of the policies being pursued by this administration. This year's budget from President Biden promotes the same failed policies, and the defense budget is not immune from the administration's misplaced priorities. At a time when inflation is 8.5%, 10.4% since Joe Biden took the oath of office, robbing the wallets of American families and eroding the purchasing power of federal agencies. It's critical that tax dollars go to their best possible use. But the president's defense budget does not do that. For example, the defense budget dedicates $3.1 billion to climate projects. Europe is experiencing the largest land invasion since World War II. President Biden executed a horrific withdrawal from Afghanistan that cost Americans lives, including a Missourian, and emboldened our enemies. China has an aggressive eye focused on Taiwan. Iran continues its march toward a nuclear weapon, but the president wants to spend finite taxpayer resources for butterflies and snakes. The request for Iron Dome funding is the bare minimum and 92% lower than what Congress just agreed to spend to support our ally, Israel. The only mention of Iron Dome in the budget is buried in an appendix. Meanwhile, the president wants to spend $34 million to address extremism in the military. If we're going to talk about extremism, let's talk about the 42 individuals on the terror watch list that have been apprehended at our southern border since President Biden took office. With the president set to end Title 42 border policy, and likely it will double to 18,000, the number of illegal immigrants trying to cross the border every day, I hope our military leaders are talking to the president about how this is not just an immigration problem, it's a national security crisis. We know DHS will need to continue calling DOD for help. That's going to impact the military's bottom line, while at the same time, the president in his budget is telling our military to be sure it funds implementation of a DOD report on equity. These are funds that will not be used to arm and protect our men and women in uniform. Given these circumstances, we must have as much transparency on the part of DOD and the administration about where funds are going and how they are being spent. We need accounting of resources like those left behind in Afghanistan that are now arming the Taliban. We need the Biden administration to maintain the commitment we saw under President Trump to have the Defense Department conduct an audit so that Congress and the American people know how and where tax dollars are being spent, so we can ensure resources are getting to the places they are needed the most. The national security threats at our border and around the world, the highest spike in prices in 40 years, skyrocketing energy cost, President Biden may see these as an inconvenient political problem, but American families, they see them as a crisis. I fear our enemies will see them as weakness. We need a budget that takes these problems seriously. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member for his opening remarks. In the interest of time, I ask that any other members who wish to make a statement submit their written statements for the record to the email inbox we established for receiving documents before and during committee proceedings. Once again, we've distributed that email address to the staffs. I will hold the record open until the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not yet have prepared written statements. Once again, I want to thank Undersecretary McCord for being here this morning. The committee has received your written statement, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. You will have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks, and you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify on the President's FY23 budget request for the Department of Defense. First, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your service to the people of Kentucky and the House and your country, and wish you all the best as you prepare to retire at the end of this Congress. It's a pleasure to be here. Nearly 20 years since I served on the staff of this committee in a very luxurious cubicle in the basement of this building, alongside your staff director and 3 other colleagues who remain on the committee staff today from that time. I appreciate the key role this committee plays in addressing our nation's priorities. Last month, President Biden released his FY23 budget request, as you know, which includes $773 billion in discretionary funding for the Department of Defense, which is a 4% increase over the FY22 enacted amount and an 8% increase over what we requested last year. This represents the largest budget request ever in nominal terms in the history of the department. Our request for the entire national defense function for FY23 totals $813.4 billion in discretionary funding and $827 billion for the function when mandatory spending is included. Given the size and scope of our department, with 3 million employees, $3 trillion in assets and worldwide missions, it's hard to summarize our goals and programs and operations briefly, but I want to highlight a few key items from our budget. Our budget was submitted to Congress alongside our new National Defense Strategy, which was designed to fill Secretary Austin's direction to match resource strategy and strategy to policy. In both the strategy and the budget, we prioritize China as our long-term pacing challenge, but we recognize Russia as an acute and dangerous threat to our interests as well. The budget advances our goal through 3 primary channels, which you may have heard the Secretary describe: integrated deterrence, campaigning, and actions to build enduring advantages. These 3 approaches are the heart of the strategy and the organizing framework for our budget. First, integrated deterrence entails developing and combining the strengths that we have for maximum effect by working across different warfighting domains, different geographic regions, different spectrums of conflict with our other agencies, other instruments of national power, and our network of allies and partners. Campaigning is something that's more done by combatant commanders. It means well-planned, well-sequenced activities and initiatives around the world that are meant to advance our priorities and gain us advantage over our competitors. For example, most notably, there's a Pacific Deterrence Initiative and a European Deterrence Initiative that I think are well known to members. Those are probably the two best examples of that. The third axis of our strategy is to build enduring advantages, and this is investments in policies that make our institutions stronger and capable for the long haul. So this is both our own people, primarily our own people, but also our industrial-based partners to make them more agile and resilient. Chairman, you mentioned some of the things focused on our own people, the basic needs allowance, which we're rolling out on based on the NDAA, and also the 4.6% pay raise for military and civilians, and implementation of the $15 minimum wage for our federal employees and federal contractors contained in the President's executive order. In the budget and in our programs, our focus was on enhancing our capabilities in ways that would make the most difference, first and foremost against China, but also against Russia. While China is our largest challenger across the military, diplomatic, and economic dimensions, I want to be clear that many of the high-priority investments in this budget do not fall neatly into a China-only box or a Russia-only box. Virtually all of our most important investments help us on both fronts, starting with the modernization of our nuclear triad, and also our investments in a more distributed and resilient space architecture that recognizes that space is no longer a sanctuary to operate in. Likewise, our investments in cyber capability and the quality of our service members, in submarines, in our industrial base, are all examples of capabilities we need to build to keep strong for all the challenges we face. And that's the logic of the idea of building and maintaining enduring advantages. Let me give one particular example of that. We have $3 billion in this budget for microelectronics, both in terms of lifetime buy procurement of chips that exist today and in research. This funding is meant to be complementary to the CHIPS Act, which we hope to see Congress pass soon. I also want to highlight in this budget, some of which you touched on, Chairman, to implement both the recommendations of our own independent review, Commission on Countering Sexual Assault, and the landmark changes in military justice in this area enacted in last year's Defense Authorization Bill. Due to the lengthy CR, we were not able to move out as quickly as we wanted to last year because it was a new start activity, but we are moving to accelerate and catch up into FY23 in this budget on this issue. Finally, I just want to highlight there's $1 billion in this budget to respond to the fuel spill at a Red Hill facility in Hawaii, and that's a strong sign of this administration's commitment to do the right thing both by our own people in Hawaii and our neighbors in Honolulu. As Secretary Austin announced last month, we plan to shut this facility down and disperse our fuel operations in the region going forward. Let me also say a word about inflation. When we saw prices changing last year, we took all the information that we could gather up to the time we finished the budget late in the calendar year and built that into our FY23 pricing. We worked with OMB to add about $20 billion a year to this program from 23 through 27 to reflect higher inflation for goods and services and the increased compensation costs for our own service members. In terms of a general inflation rate, I know a lot of people focus on this consumer price index. That's not what we use at DOD. We use the chain-weighted price index for the GDP deflator, which is required by law, first of all, but also more reflective of what we buy. We also use a number of specific price indices for fuel, for housing costs, for our health care. As you know, prices have continued to evolve since we finalized our budget. We recognize the impact of global economic conditions on our ability to deliver the capabilities in this budget, and we're prepared to work with Congress to find the best solutions to address these challenges as we move forward toward the congressional oversight of this budget. To conclude, Mr. Chairman, the people of our department are working hard every day to protect and advance our security and advance the security of our allies and partners. We're doing everything we can to assist the people of Ukraine in their struggle against Russian aggression, which we could not do without your strong support in Congress. I'm ready to discuss that issue further during our session today. Along the lines of the whole of government approach that you mentioned, our department is ready to serve as an important instrument of national power whenever called on, and sometimes in ways that are not particularly visible to the American people. For example, we played an important support role in the effort to control the COVID-19 pandemic, using our contracting and logistics capabilities to award over $30 billion of contracts for vaccines and deliver 297 million syringes to put shots in arms on behalf of HHS. Likewise, working with HHS and AID, we've awarded $7 billion in contracts to procure 1 billion doses of vaccine for global distribution. So this is not something we're doing with our defense budget, but doing with our capabilities to help out our interagency partners. Our budget is grounded in our strategy, and our primary focus is on increasing our capability to make our force better, not to make it a larger force. Given the security challenges we face, I urge the committee to fully support the President's budget request for national defense. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions about this budget.
Thank you very much for your statement. I figured I'd give you the liberty of couple more minutes since we're talking about an awful lot of money. We'll now begin our question and answer session. As a reminder, members can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and responses will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so by sending them electronically to the email inbox we've established within 7 days of the hearing. As is my habit, I will defer my questioning to the end, so I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary McCord, for being here today. I just want to focus on the issue of America and the rest of the world's addiction to Russian oil and refined petroleum products. The world gives Vladimir Putin $1 billion every single day for the gas and oil that Russia provides to European Union countries, to the United States, and to Germany. Our addiction to oil has weaponized the war in Ukraine and to take advantage of the fact that the United States is not energy independent. In fact, according to the Energy Information Agency, last year, the United States imported 672,000 barrels every single day, or 22 million barrels a month, of Russian crude oil and refined petroleum products. We just spent $6 trillion in 3 Middle East wars, primarily because of our addiction to their oil. Despite what we say, we are not energy independent. Today, in the world, there are 211 lithium-ion battery factories. Batteries make up 30 to 40% of the entire cost of an electric vehicle. 211 lithium-ion batteries worldwide. 156 are in China, 22 are in Europe, and 12 are in the United States. Americans, 75% say they want an electric vehicle. 50% are reluctant to purchase an electric vehicle because of lack of confidence about charging infrastructure. So how does the Department of Defense assess the importance of developing electric vehicles to become energy independent and to combat climate change and to our national defense strategy?
Excuse me, thank you. Probably the primary area where we feel like we can make a difference more quickly is on vehicles, on vehicles and aircraft, as you say. Aircraft are what consume most of our energy in the Defense Department, and we do have some programs that are going to take longer to deliver, something called the blended wing body, which is something that will benefit both our longer range aircraft like a tanker, but also of interest on the commercial side, so hopefully a win-win for the department and the private sector. On the climate side in the department, one of the key factors that we thought about here in this past year building this budget was trying to, as you say, look at where the market is moving so that we are not wedding ourselves to technology that industry is not going to be producing in a few years, so that we are not in the situation we are in with something like a submarine where we're buying something, we're the only one who buys something. Right. So we are looking for wins that will keep us in sync with the market, that will reduce our logistic tail. It's something you look at today in Russia, Ukraine. The Russians are suffering greatly by their poor logistics. This is something, not to say that their capabilities are anywhere near ours, but this is a situation you don't want to be in where you're tied down by your logistics strain. So we're looking to make ourselves more agile as well as market friendly with these investments.
Without Russian oil and gas exports, the Putin regime would collapse. It is estimated that 300,000 young people under the age of 40 that are tech savvy. Russia produces more software engineers than any country in the world and twice that of the United States. The problem for Russia is it's an economy that's shrinking, its population is shrinking, and all the people that are leaving are the young people that are looking for a better way of life somewhere else. So when you look at, 35 to 40% of the entire economy is gas and oil, and we, and in Western Europe, are addicted to that gas and oil, that empowers Putin. Then he steals the money from the Russian people, gives it to oligarchs, that puts that money in rule of law nations. So it's harder to sanction those monies, because in rule of law nations, people that have money have rights. So it just seems to me that this all comes down to the very same conclusion. We are stuck in a bad situation, not entirely, but primarily because we and the rest of the world are addicted to oil and gas that Vladimir Putin drills into the ground, doesn't diversify his economy. People don't have rights. The Russian economy is tanking, and that economy and that country is getting older and poorer because all the young people are leaving. Now, maybe the silver lining here is that they'll come to the United States and use their skills that they can't, realize their full potential in a country like Russia. So thank you for being here.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now I yield 10 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCord, President Biden's defense budget spends $3.1 billion on climate programs. It's 5 times more than the administration requested last year. How does the administration justify funneling billions of dollars to the Green New Deal agenda rather than protecting our men and women in uniform?
Mr. Smith, we feel that these investments are things primarily that we need to happen anyway. We're always going to invest in our facilities. We're always going to invest in some kind of vehicle, some kind of aircraft. So we're trying to have them be ones that are going to move us in the right direction to reduce our dependence on logistic trains when we're moving. On the tactical side, on the non-tactical side, normal vehicles that are moved around for other things. Again, we're trying to be where the market is so that we're investing in vehicles and batteries that industry is going to be producing. So we don't feel that it's an either or that is taking away from things that we would be otherwise needed. We're always going to invest in vehicles, always going to invest in our facilities.
You have a funding stream in here to implement a DOD equity report. You also include $34 million for DOD to address extremism within the ranks. DOD has identified fewer than 100 instances of confirmed extremist activity in 2021, and investigators have turned up no more than a handful of so-called extremists within a military of 2.1 million people. Why does the administration believe our military is full of extremists? Or is this just furthering a narrative of political convenience?
Mr. Smith, I think the Secretary does not believe, and I'm sure he's convinced that our military is not full of extremists. He is concerned that one is too many, and therefore that he feels strongly about the need for both to address extremism and prevent it from being an issue in our force, but also on the broader issue of diversity. As he well knows, our military, as you know, is very diverse. But when you get to the top, the leadership looks less diverse and looks less like the force that it leads. And so he is concerned about both of these things as making the team as strong as possible, that it be a diverse team from the bottom to the top, and that extremism, while rare, is very divisive and corrosive of good order and discipline.
For $34 million, the military could purchase over 100 tactical vehicles. It could purchase a couple of additional Abrams tanks, items far more beneficial to our troops in the field and to the success of their missions. What exactly are you planning to spend this $34 million on?
Mr. Smith, I would have to get you the details for the record of down below line at line.
I definitely would love the details, and so would the American people. Well, it seems this idea that the military has somehow been infiltrated by extremists, white nationalists, and neo-Nazi sympathizers won't go away, because just this week, the Democrats, they had planned to move a bill calling for investigations into the military and law enforcement for terrorist activity, something I find deeply offensive. When you testified last year, I asked you about the cost of the president's decision to cancel the border wall. We have estimates that the government is spending $6 million per day to DOD contractors to essentially babysit $350 million in unused border wall material. We sent you a letter as well, to which we've yet to hear back. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit the letter for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How much funding has DOD spent on litigation and settling disputes related to contracts for the border wall?
Mr. Smith, we can get you that for the record. I don't believe that the total will be very high because, of course, on litigation,
If you can get me that, we've been asking for a year. I would appreciate that, and I love that you said that here in committee. How many border wall contracts has DOD canceled since the start of the Biden administration?
I don't have that number at my fingertips. I don't believe the number of contracts was large. The dollar amount may have been larger, but I don't think there were that many different contracts.
Can you give us that information?
The number of contracts.
Hopefully in a timely fashion, too. And how much more of DOD funds does the administration intend to spend on settling these contracts?
I'm not aware that we've spent anything to settle yet, but
How much are you intending to set aside to settle?
we don't have funds set aside for border wall litigation in the.
So you won't be able to settle any contracts if you have no money set aside?
Well, we, the Department of Defense, would work in concert with the Department of Justice, who is always the lead for litigation for
As soon as you have any settlements, I would love to have that information, and I think the Budget Committee members would love that as well. We know DHS has had to request assistance from DOD to aid in dealing with the border crisis. Does DOD support the President's plan to lift the Title 42 border policy and double the number of illegal immigrants, roughly 18,000 folks attempting to enter the U.S. each day?
I don't know that the Department of Defense was asked or has provided a view on that policy matter. I will say on support to the border, that is something that has occurred every year that I've been associated with the department. So for at least a dozen years in a row, the Department of Homeland Security asks us to provide security. I think many members are familiar with. We're not directly in contact with illegal immigrants, but we are on the intelligence side and the support side. That would be continuing this year. The Secretary has already responded to Secretary Mayorkas's request that we be prepared to provide support again this year.
Is DOD planning for the contingency that it will have to fund some sort of effort to assist DHS with the border crisis? And how much of its budget does DOD believe will need to be allocated to assist DHS?
In recent years, the average has been about 0.1%, about $500 or $600 million a year is the bill that we have tended to run up each year in providing support to the border wall.
Okay.
I'm sorry, support on the border, not to the border wall, excuse me.
Last year, I asked you about what areas of the defense budget are impacted the most by increases in inflation. You said probably the thing that we notice the most rapidly in the Defense Department is when fuel prices change because we're such a large consumer of fuel. We have seen a dramatic rise in fuel prices since President Biden took office. In fact, 88.9% increase. How have these higher fuel prices affected DOD?
What we discussed last year is still the case today, that fuel is our most volatile and easily recognizable price increase when prices change. This year, in FY22, we have already seen a fuel price increase in the first couple of months of $1.5 billion. That cost increase was made known to the appropriations committees who provided funding for that in the omnibus appropriations bill that was signed 6 weeks ago. Wow. Since that time, largely due to the price spike after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we estimate a bill of $1.8 billion for the rest of this fiscal year. So over $3 billion across the course of this fiscal year in increased fuel prices if the situation remains as we see it today.
Wow, $3 billion is a lot. And, you know, in fact, in an exchange between Chairman Yarmouth and the OMB director, Shalonda Young, last month, they suggested that since DOD can lock in prices in advance with contracts, DOD's budget is not particularly impacted by inflationary increases or fuel cost. Do you agree with Chairman and Director Young, or do you disagree and see that as a real concern? $3 billion seems like a real concern.
Mr. Smith, we do have contracts, but we are, although we are a very large consumer of fuel, we are still at the 1% level in terms of the fuel market.
But it's a concern.
We cannot move the markets ourselves, and we don't have an ability to buy long-term contracts that completely insulate us from. We do buy by contract, but they only go so far out.
So the president's budget proposes the bare minimum of funding for the Iron Dome defense system for our ally Israel. The funding level is 92% less than what was recently adopted in the bipartisan fashion by Congress. The administration also buries any mention of Iron Dome in an appendix to the budget. Does DOD believe the bare minimum of funding is enough to support Israel? And what support of signal does that send to our ally Israel and to Israel's enemies about US's commitments when it's obvious Iran is charging full speed ahead to a nuclear weapon?
I would say the department has a pretty long history of cooperative programs with Israel, including Arrow and David Sling. The Iron Dome funding last year, of course, was a spike because of the rocket attacks, and the request from the government of Israel for $1 billion was over and above the normal support. So we are continuing the normal support, but we don't have anything. That was a one-time $1 billion last year request from Israel based on this specific incident.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your service and your testimony. This budget request unifies the Army's modernization strategy under the Army Futures Command, which is based in Austin, Texas, with almost an additional $1 billion over the current budget. And after a year that Army Futures has described as a standout year. So I'm pleased to see that provision, though I remain concerned that a permanent commanding general has not yet been submitted to the Senate. Particularly important in the cooperation with Army Futures Command, which is so unique, is the involvement and engagement with the private sector, with the University of Texas on trauma care, which promises great benefits to the civilian sector as well, and the work with Austin Community College in opening the doors on an Army software factory. So I'm very pleased to see that that is happening. I'm a little amazed, but perhaps those who view the events that occurred here that culminated with the attempt to overthrow the government on January the 6th dismiss the need to focus on domestic extremism. I think all those who don't believe in the fantasy that this was a legitimate political discourse would have to applaud the portion of this budget that's allocated to concerns about domestic extremism. Likewise, I find the ranking member's criticism of the portion of this budget allocated to addressing the existential challenge of the climate crisis, I think they would be shocking were they not repeated so frequently. The climate crisis is one of our most serious national security challenges, as not only this budget, but one former national security leader after another, people like Admiral Dennis Blair, have recognized that we need to be dealing with this and that we are already facing the dangers to our families of not addressing the climate crisis. So I think the real danger to our families, security-wise, is not from this budget, but from those who continue to be climate deniers. Finally, Mr. McCord, as far as Ukraine is concerned, our most immediate issue right now, it's very encouraging to see what happened with the secretaries going to Kyiv this week and with the developments yesterday, the fact that this administration doesn't take a go-it-alone approach, but is uniting both NATO and countries outside of NATO to help. Can you outline for us basically what this budget is doing concerning our ongoing commitment to give the Ukrainians everything that they need to defend their freedom and prevent advances beyond Ukraine by Russian atrocities in Moldova or elsewhere?
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. Our budget per se for 23 was built before, it was finalized before the invasion occurred. So there's not a direct straight line from invasion, therefore the budget does X, Y, Z. What I will say is that for 22, we had a supplemental attached to the omnibus appropriation bill with strong support for both the state and the DOD sides of support to Ukraine. We have, as of the end of this week, we will have pretty much used all of that, the drawdown and Ukraine Security Initiative funding. We anticipate sending an additional supplemental to Congress this week to continue to message that we are in this with the Ukrainians, we and our partners, to make sure that, that they have what they need to continue their fight against Russian aggression. So for 23, we're going to be reviewing this summer to what extent our posture in Europe should change. And then there's a lot of variables there. It may seem obvious that the answer would be we're going to have more troops stationed in Europe, but given that Russia may emerge weaker, there needs to be some analysis before we jump to that conclusion. We will be doing that analysis this summer. I think that we will be able to, after the NATO summit this summer, and after that analysis, we'll be able to come back to Congress and say, what do we think needs to happen in Europe for our own posture? Is the U.S. anchor of NATO, in addition then to what is the nature of the conflict? Is it over? Is it turned into a frozen conflict? Is it still an active conflict? But I anticipate that we will be continuing to stand with the Ukrainians, and if we need to ask for additional funding in 23, specifically to assist the Ukrainians, I would anticipate that the Secretary will be back before Congress to talk about that. But the budget itself continues the underlying framework of European Deterrence Initiative, and we look forward to seeing how we can strengthen that in concert with our allies at the NATO summit this summer.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. McCord, for being here today. The Biden budget includes several misplaced priorities while it fails to fund programs critical to national security. The budget does not fund American Air Power. The Air Force would be forced to cut 150 aircraft, including 21 A-10s, 33 F-22 Raptors, 50 T-1 Jayhawks, and 13 KC-135 refuelers. The Air Force would also cut 15 F-35 jets compared to last year's budget request. The Army troop levels, if enacted, this budget, would result in the smallest Army we've had since World War II. Navy ships. The Navy ships, we would reduce our total fleet by 24 to 280. China, meanwhile, is continuing to have more ships, and we say we need 350 ships. Not to mention, we have sent numerous supplies to Ukraine, whether that be Javelin missiles or launchers, whether that be Stingers or Stinger armaments, S-300, artillery, small arms, or is anything in this budget replacing or replenishing our ammunition that we will need to fight tomorrow should the need arise? We cannot fight with weapon systems or ammunition that is produced in the future. We have to fight with what we have in stock on day. So all that being said, my first question is there are a lot of different numbers and percentages being thrown around regarding the defense budget. The administration is claiming this request is an increase, a 9.8% increase for DOD to be exact. But just to be clear, this is compared to FY21, not FY22. Is that correct? Which is only a 2.2% increase.
You're correct that the two-year increase was 10%, and the reason that we mentioned that was that up until the time we were finishing, it wasn't clear what was going to happen with FY22, so it was a good way to sort of anchor from 21 to 23 before we knew where 22 was going to come out.
Now, refresh my memory, this is also based on a 2% inflation rate, which we know is greater than 8%. Is that correct, this budget?
Our budget is a real increase with the inflation rate that's in our budget. Obviously, inflation continues to evolve, and the numbers will be known for good a year and a half from now when FY23 inflation is a fact as opposed to a projection.
But it's an 8% inflation rate now over last year, not a 2% inflation rate.
Not in terms of the deflators that we use. In terms of the CPI.
Let me get to the next point. But even at a 2.2% increase over last year's budget, even the 2% number you gave last year means defense spending is flat this year under the Biden budget.
Again, our budget is a real increase over both the enacted and the requested last year, but the exact numbers will be fluctuating as if inflation continues to be dynamic as it is right now.
And it continues to have $3.1 billion on climate programs. Is that correct?
That is the figure that we have in the budget. That's
and
correct.
I haven't seen any electric tanks or electric vehicles operating in the Ukraine theater. Have you?
No, and tanks are not a primary level of lever that we're trying to electrify.
Are the cuts to the Air Force fighter procurement, total Navy ships, Army troop levels due to the administration's insistence that we can spend more money on green policies? If not, can you tell me why we're cutting ships, airplanes, and troops?
Yes, thank you for that question. I realize this is an issue that the committees are going to grapple with as they go through their markups on the Armed Services Committee where you sit and elsewhere in the appropriations process. The primary rationale for some of these reductions is that we're trying to divest ourselves of older, less capable systems that we don't think are going to cut it in a high-end fight with China if it comes to that. So that the ships, in particular the older LCS, are just not that capable. The A-10s are good airplanes.
Okay, let me real quick, because I only have time for one more
is the
question.
rationale.
And I'm sorry, I want the rest of your answer, but I need to ask this one more question. Of the unfunded requirements list, the UFERs, that every year we want to fill, those are things that we need that we don't have funds for. How many of those could be funded with the 3.1 billion, billion in green climate stuff?
I believe the total of all the combatant commander chief unfunded lists are much higher than $3 billion. So yes, you could use the $3 billion in another way if the committee's.
With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and now you have 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCord, as the Chief Financial Officer, I'm sure that you're aware of the recent report including findings from the Department of Defense Inspector General that highlighted what I would say is the broken and wasteful sole source contracting and spare parts equipment system, acquisition system. The Pentagon and the American taxpayers, I think, are really getting ripped off by many of these contracts. Some of those contractors have raised prices on essential items to the tune of more than 3,000%. In 2021, officials said that the U.S. Air Force paid a price of $10,000 to replace toilet seat covers. Now, I go way back to a time when we talked about $1,000 toilet seats for a military cargo plane. And I ask unanimous consent to put into the record this article, the Air Force's $10,000 toilet cover.
Without objection.
And it seems to me that many of these small but vital parts and components are necessary, but because they can often be labeled commercial items, that contractors can refuse to provide the information that is, and the cost information, and prevents us from actually getting the best price. So I know that the department itself at one point in 2012 said that there ought to be legislation that would reform the contracting process and lower the prices. So I wanted to know what you would say about these excessive prices that the contractors are charging.
Thank you for that question. I would say I'm not familiar with the Air Force particular contract that you're citing, but I would say in general you are correct that we have a different standard for commercial items than we do for non-commercial items, and that's a judgment that the department and the committee.
Well, does that mean that we have a harder time doing negotiations for a lower price?
Well, for a commercial item, yes, you're not supposed to be spending the same amount of time negotiating or doing contract auditing on the back end, and that's a trade-off that everybody has to make a judgment on as to whether, if every commercial item went through the same scrutiny as a submarine, then you would have, you'd need a lot more contract auditors, you'd have additional costs and time spent. So that's, again, a trade-off that we've collectively have made, that commercial items should live by a different standard, so that because we often hear it's too hard to do business with the department smaller firms.
Well,
and
let me
we
just
have
say,
no
though, that the
balance.
Department of Defense apparently found that if you just use, that there's a way to produce the same thing for $300 instead of $10,000. It seems it might be worth checking out whether some of these commercial things are worth it.
Agree.
Well, so tell me, how are we going to do something about addressing this problem of contractors who may be gouging
Well,
taxpayers and the Department of Defense?
Well, in terms of entering into the contract itself, of course, that'd be the responsibility of contracting officers on the acquisition side of the department. I'm not an acquisition official myself, but there is another line of defense, if you will, in the contracting officers themselves deciding what to purchase and how they go about entering into those contracts. But for the contract audit piece that does report to me, again, we do have a different standard for commercial items.
Aside from the issue of commercial items, the report that was made said that we are paying up to 3,000 times more for items from contractors. As the chief financial officer, don't you think this is something that we have to really look into?
I would agree that our pricing should be looked at, and as you know, of course, there have been pricing increases due to the supply chain problems of the last year or two, and I don't know the date of time period that your report is focusing on, if it's during that supply chain issue or before. But yes, I agree that contract pricing is important.
Okay, this was done by the DOD Inspector General, so this is not my report. This is the DOD Inspector General, and I hope you'll look into it, because we shouldn't be paying these exorbitant prices, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired, and now I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
First of all, I couldn't agree more with Ms. Shankowski's line of questioning. I'm not as interested in whether we're spending more or less on the military this year as I am concerned about whether we're getting more or less for what we're spending. I happen to agree with Ronald Reagan that defense is not a budget issue. You spend what you need to spend in order to protect the country. But as was pointed out in a recent article in The Hill by Ben Freeman and William Hartung, they noted that the budget would give the Pentagon more money by far than at any time during the heights of the Korean War, Vietnam War, or Cold War, even when accounting for inflation. Despite this historically high level of Pentagon spending, the military has been shrinking. They point out that since 1985, our Navy fleet shrunk from 571 to 298 ships. Our Air Force has declined from 10,458 planes to 5,217. And our military force has shrunk from 2.1 million active duty personnel to just under 1.4 million. They go on to write, well, some might argue that while quantities of military equipment are down, quality has gone up. But it's precisely the most advanced weapons programs that have proven to be the biggest budget blunders. China's spending, according to independent analyses, about $250 billion a year on its military. That's less than a third of what the administration proposes, and yet China seems to be massively outbuilding us in terms of ships, weapon systems. Their armed force is twice the size of ours. What are you doing about this? Or as the millennials would say, WTF.
Mr. McClintock, and this is the same subject I think Mr. Kelly was touching on quality versus quantity. We do judge that, for example, the Army decided that the numbers were telling them that they could not recruit to a bigger number right now, given the historically low unemployment and other factors out there. So rather than chase a bigger Army that wasn't...
Well, I'm asking, why are we spending so much more and getting so much less?
I don't believe we are getting less. We have very capable systems that are better than the Chinese systems.
We're spending more, and yet we've got half the ships and half the planes we had in 1985. This is unacceptable.
But again, the number that just counting people or counting ships.
What would you say are the biggest sources? Let me just ask you this: what would you say are the biggest sources of waste in the defense budget?
I think probably one of the biggest sources of high cost in the defense budget are the things that we buy that are so unique to the military that there's no commercial market for.
What are we? Where are the biggest sources of waste in the Defense Department, or have you even turned your attention to that? Let me go. On Earth Day this year, President Biden said, I love this quote, "One of the things I found out as President of the United States, I get to spend a lot of that money. We're going to start the process where every vehicle in the United States military, every vehicle, is going to be climate friendly. Every vehicle, I mean it. We're spending billions of dollars to do it." A few years ago, the GAO reported that green energy mandates under Obama cost the Navy as much as $150 per gallon for jet fuel. That's high even for California standards. In 2012, the Navy was forced to purchase 450,000 gallons of biofuel for its so-called green fleet at the cost of $26.60 per gallon, when conventional petroleum costs just $2.50 per gallon. These mandates forced the Air Force to pay $59 per gallon for 11,000 gallons of biofuel in 2012, 10 times more than regular jet fuel costs. Is this a wise use of our defense dollars?
Well, I would say, as I said to Mr. Smith a few minutes ago, we have a big price increase for conventional fuel right now. So I think there's wisdom in us to
paying more for non-conventional.
There's wisdom in us diversifying our sources of fuel.
With all due respect, Mr. McCord, that's
our sources
nuts.
of fuel and energy.
And that's sapping our ability to adequately field a defense force. One more thing. In 2010, Admiral Mike Mullen, chairman of Joint Chiefs, said that in his professional military judgment, our greatest national security threat was the national debt. That year, that debt was $13 trillion. Today, it's over $30 trillion. Does the administration agree that's still our biggest national security threat?
If you say the administration, I can't speak to what
the military
how
establishment.
the president would rank these threats, but the debt is a threat, climate is a threat, China is. We have a number of issues we don't get to focus on.
So you would place the climate in the same category as China or the national debt? You know, countries that bankrupt themselves aren't around very long, because before you can provide for the common defense, you have to be able to pay for it. And don't tell me, oh, well, they've cut the deficit in half this year. That's compared to the blowout spending of the last 2 years. You go back to the last pre-pandemic year, the deficit this year under this budget balloons 50%. And it wasn't the Republican tax cuts. Revenues went up after those cuts, not down. The only reason the deficit continued was because we couldn't say no to spending. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'm going to give the undersecretary the opportunity to finish answering the question that Mr. McClintock asked, if you want to.
Chairman, let me just come back one more time on the subject of quantity versus quality, which I think is the part that you're referring to. We do have a reduction the Navy proposed, and we at OSD agreed with some older, less capable ships, the littoral combat ships, and in particular. Same on the aircraft side. The KC-135s that Mr. Kelly referred to are being replaced by the new KC-46s. Just counting the numbers, the things that we're divesting are not equal in any sense capable to the ones that we're buying, but they cost you money to maintain them, speaking of what is perceived to be wasteful. So ships that are not going to be effective in a high-end contest with China but cost us money to maintain, divert money from the things that we think we need to buy. And this is something that any executive would look at, right, is divesting from older, less capable things to move to newer technology. But these are difficult trade-offs for people, and it does lead to quantity reductions, having fewer ships or fewer aircraft. But again, we think these are wise investments, but these are things that we need to persuade Congress of or not. I mean, that's a big part of every annual defense authorization debate, is whether or not we will be allowed to retire older systems that we propose to retire.
Thank you for that answer. Now you have 5 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Cirrus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Undersecretary McCord, thank you very much for your service to this country. Mr. McCord, I am the chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, and I am committed to ensuring our relationships with countries in Central, South, and in the Caribbean are always progressing. How does the Pentagon's requested budget impact U.S. national security in the Western Hemisphere?
Thank you. As you know, in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in Central and South America, our so-called Southern Command area of responsibility, it continues to be an area where we have minimal military force, minimal military presence, and the whole of government center of gravity is more diplomatic, economic, which is why we have our Southern Command in Miami, which is sort of the financial and diplomatic capital of the region. We do continue to have a minimal economic force level there because the military threats don't justify more. The primary thing that we are continuing to look at here is the inroads that China is attempting to make using all of their levers, economic, loan, information. So that is probably the number one thing that we're looking at, in addition to, and then secondarily, the counter-narcotics issues are our big line of effort in that region. In the Western Hemisphere writ large, in the Northern Hemisphere, of course, we have the Northern Command, and we're looking at a wide range of issues from assisting Homeland Security with cyber protection of the United States and our critical infrastructure. So, in that meaning of Western Hemisphere, we have a lot going on.
What resources are being made available to ensure our regional partners and allies have support in countering malign influences in the Western Hemisphere? I know that we have different pacts with, let's say, with the Dominican Republic, or we have Costa Rica. Are we increasing our efforts and our money to work with these countries to improve the security of our country?
I would have to get you for the record whether what specific budget levels that there are. We have exercise budgets that are not always line item because we don't want to let them unfold, and we don't lock them in advance in our budget. But we are continuing the efforts that we've had in Southern Command area of responsibility with exercises with all of our partners.
You know, one rumor that's floating around in my community is that Cuba is working with Russia in terms of having another boat lift, happen. I'm just wondering if we are defensively prepared for such a exodus again from Cuba. Have you heard anything like that in your?
I have not. I would have to consult with General Richardson, our commander at Southern Command, as to what operations and contingency plans are most prominent in Southcom's efforts and planning right now.
Thank you. And my last question has to do with the countries facing the Pacific. I'm talking about Argentina, I'm talking about Chile, I'm talking about Peru. How are we working with these people to offset the China influence?
Again, this gets back to, I know the chairman mentioned the whole of government approach, and as I did as well. This is something that we cannot do by ourselves as the Department of Defense. We are certainly keeping an eye on Chinese and Russian attempts to buy influence, to buy friends, to access resources in the region. But Southern Command by themselves does not have the authority, does not have the responsibility really of being the only way that we counter Russian and Chinese inroads in Central and South America. We do play our role, and that's why again Southern Command is co-located with so many other agencies in Miami, because we have connections to state and to Drug Enforcement Administration, all the other levers of government, the Coast Guard. Again, I would have to consult with General Richardson to get you a better answer on exactly what all of her plans are for her region.
Thank you, Chairman.